Wonderful. So again, thank you for joining us to today's session regarding community development and disaster recovery. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be introducing Lou Mitchell from the Possibilities Lab. Some of you may or may not have heard of Lou and her background over multiple decades now in working in this space, particularly in disaster recovery and emergency management. And she's held many senior roles, including at the Australian Emergency Management Institute, where she was developing and leading workshops and education programs for organisations actually focusing on the very topic that we're here for today, but potentially from a lens of a strength-based approach, and empowering communities to, be able to focus on leadership, local collaboration, and well-being. So Louise is currently working for a national collaboration in the field of community recovery as a disaster, or as a national consultant for disaster recovery on the social reference group here in Australia, which is where the Possibilities Lab comes from. And I'll let Louise or Lou talk about that a little bit more. So probably there are so many facets, and I could sit here and talk to you for the next 45 minutes on Louise Mitchell, because I am an absolute fangirl, and I've also had the privilege of being one of the speakers at the Possibilities Lab, and it's a great space that is being held there for workers in disaster recovery, because, as well as looking after communities and supporting them through the recovery process, it's really important as community development practitioners and disaster recovery people that we actually look after ourselves as well. I've experienced myself not looking after myself well, particularly when you live and work in the communities that have been impacted by disaster. So without saying any more, I'm going to hand over to you, Lou, as you're the person that everybody's come to hear from today. So thank you. Take it away.
Thanks, Michelle, and great to be here with you all. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm just as equally a fan of yours, Michelle. So what we thought, in listening to you all, it was I could have prepared quite a different presentation. So I have got a whole lot of resources as well that I'll show you that we've been working on. So there's so many facets to working with communities in preparation for, during, and after a disaster. And I think the thing is that I don't see it as disaster focused. I see it as community focused, and it's a disruption to the community. So there's a lot of focus on the response, but it's all of those relationships beforehand that are enduring during and then after that make all the difference. So I will go to my slides and then I'll tell you who I've been working with. And I hear that some of you are working in community development in communities all the time, not just with a disaster lens. And that is so important. And one of my wonderings is, how do we make sure that's integrated when we employ recovery officers who come in to do community development work? So I might follow my script and my slides and then try and make sure that we've got time for questions and discussion afterwards. So I'll just share this screen. And it's not that one I want to share. While I'm there, that's the Possibility Lab that we run, that I'm actually going to talk about. And you'll see some interesting resources on there. Really, I'll stop sharing that one and I'll share the right one. And I'll talk more about that at the end. There it is. Okay, from the start. Yeah, so really that's what Michelle and I decided I might talk about today, this learning network that we started back in July 2020, but I had to initiate it earlier than that, because I'm employed by the Social Recovery Reference Group, which is a national group in Australia that is really an independent group that the different government agencies, who are the departments of communities, pay for. So they pay for my role to bring them all together. So as you know, in Australia, that we're a federated nation with states, and our states are responsible for response and recovery. And so these departments of communities who look after the welfare aspect and community development, they want to learn from each other in the states and the Commonwealth. So we get together a lot to talk about things. And really that's what we're established for, to drive the human and social perspective in emergency management, and the centrality of community. So there's structures, as there are in government. There's the Australian New Zealand Emergency Management Committee, and they've got a couple of subcommittees, and just really briefly, we sit under there in that structure as one of the subcommittees. And we've got, these are our members. There's paying members in yellow that contribute to the position I'm in, and then there's other members as well. So that's them. So yeah, we started the Possibility Lab really in March. I had to start saying, after in Australia, we had the 2019-20 bushfires, which, if I just go back, started in Queensland, swept through the east coast of New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. So they were quite extensive bushfires, some of the biggest we've seen in the country. They actually set up a new national organisation. Victoria set up a new recovery organisation. So all of this stuff was happening in the recovery space that was new. It's kind of the worst time to set up new organisations to deal with issues after the disaster. Anyway, but it does have opportunities. It brought resources. What I knew was going to happen as I watched these fires going through was there's funding packages our federal government has in combination with the states. So the states and the federal government pay money when the disaster is big enough to employing community development officers, or community recovery officers, they're called in some states, to go into communities. And I know from the past, because it's happened over the last 10 years before that the demands on these positions are enormous. And I'll go into that in a minute. So I got together with actually a couple of other facilitators, like learning facilitators, and I said, wouldn't it be good if we did this? Let's get all the governance happening, and we did that, and we're able to start it in July. So what we were focusing on was creating a space to learn together, to workshop issues and challenges, and really to try and form a supportive network with peers for all of those working across Australia in community recovery. So we know that it's so complex. It's so complex working in community development anyway, but then throw in a disaster and you've got, people are more either anxious or frustrated with all of the things they've got to deal with. And I would say it's not only public service bureaucracy, it's all of the philanthropic stuff coming in as well. As well as trauma for some people. I know that people over the last few years some have said we're using the word trauma too much. So I usually say frustration, stress, anxiety, and trauma is what people are experiencing. And if you're a community development worker stepping into work with communities, you can't help but vicariously experience that as well as you possibly live in those communities, or one of those communities that has been impacted. So that was our aim. That's what we wanted to do. And we wanted to, provide this safe space. So I've talked a little bit about the need, what it's like to step into the role. I'll talk, going along the bottom, I'll talk a little bit about the why we did it, who came, the experience they had, because we did an evaluation, because I know working in government, unless you can prove the worth of something you're doing, it won't keep going. So I made sure I put the evaluation into the program at the beginning. How we designed it and facilitated it, what the participants found of value, and then I'll talk about what next. So it's tough to step into this kind of role. It can be isolating. People who have stepped into these roles haven't done community development practice before, some have never worked in the recovery environment and don't know what to expect. So the demands are enormous, and it has a huge impact, and there is potential for harm and vicarious trauma unless you're supported well. And that depends on the organisation you're in. So we got about 75 people who registered because we did contain it to only those who were funded through this particular package. So they were CROs or CDOs, community recovery officers or community development officers, funded through the state Commonwealth package. We generally had about 20 people at most sessions. Sometimes we had up to 40, but really it didn't matter. It was come as you wish to come, much like this model. And some people came because they wanted to listen to particular speakers. Our core group of about 20 people who would come most of the time, they did form this tight, bonded, supportive network. So in terms of what the participants said it was like to participate, they said there was a real culture and values created. It was a safe space. There was rich learning. This was a 9-month evaluation. They were challenged. They felt supported, not judged. And they really found there was an emphasis on listening to others. So we actually tried to create that through our design. So I come from, I don't know if you've heard of the Centre for Courage and Renewal, which is based in the US, but has facilitators worldwide. So I come from a foundation of facilitation practice that's based on that. And Dave Newell and Peter Piggott, who helped me form this, come from an art of hosting tradition. So we kind of melded our facilitation traditions and passions and took great care in setting this up. And so some of the design principles we employed were around the learning happens when you hear yourself into speech, really to make time for the conversation. We had breakout groups in each session. We, like you, designed a check-in and a check-out. We used open questions to frame the sessions. And we had both a charged space and a safe space. So we were trying to bring issues as well, not that we had to try too hard in recovery. So these were the principles that we used for how we would be together. We didn't co-design these. We brought them to the group, and the group, agreed. They had only so much time really to participate. It was 90 minutes a month that we'd do it regularly on a Tuesday, 12 to 1:30. So just acknowledging one another as equals and giving and receiving welcome, turning to wonder and curiosity and setting aside judgment and defensiveness as you both listen to yourself and others. So we emphasize that. Just saying, offer what you can here, ask for what you need. It's all invitational, really slowing down into the space so that there's time to think and reflect, and gifting your presence to people, especially in those small groups. And remembering that conversation is the natural way that humans think together. Knowing that sometimes, it wasn't perfect. It was a little bit messy. We couldn't resolve everything, of course. And the really critical one was to maintain confidentiality. So we wouldn't repeat what we heard outside of the space. It's really a space for personal learning. So we shorten that now to, welcoming, open and curious, invitational, embrace the messy, confidential, think together and slow down. So we used open questions as well throughout to really bring their voices into the space. And I just wanted to also say, I know this is fairly small, but I'm happy to share any of this, but we had guest speakers that provided that content. So I think it's really important not just to come and gather, but to have a content focus. So we looked at, you know, the dynamics of collective disruption and your work. We have national principles in Australia for disaster recovery. We use different models. In another session, we explored community-led recovery. What does that actually mean for community to lead their own recovery? Around the time, people requested what they wanted to do next. So at one stage, people wanted to really talk about ritual, anniversary, symbol and memorial. Monitoring and evaluation in disaster recovery, we had guest speakers around that. One of the really powerful ones was running a peer-to-peer consultancy where someone came with a problem, and we ran a protocol, a consultancy protocol around that, a real listening and reflecting back. And at one point they stepped out and the group talked about that issue so that they could listen to what other people were thinking. And so we can share. Do you normally share slides, Michelle, at all?
Absolutely, we can share them via the IACD website.
Okay, so I won't go through all of the content, but I just wanted to make the point that we make sure that there's something kind of meaty in each session. And the last session of last year, we did what would you tell your 1 week self? A lot of the people who were coming had been working then for, you know, probably 18 months to some 2 years in these community development recovery roles. And so that's on the Possibility Lab website, which we'll share with you. And that was really nice to hear. And then we got their permission to share that, what they said they'd tell their 1 week self. So participants said the value of this was the knowledge and learning, the networking, and the collegial support. That was one of the outcomes of the evaluation. And really, in terms of the way we set it up, I really wanted to create a living knowledge network. We have a lot of books on the shelf. We've got a national recovery handbook. We've got the national principles. But and so many more documents that you can look at in recovery. But if you're in it, it's that live learning, it's the workshopping with others, and bringing your issues. So sometimes we do a breakout room and people came back and said, we didn't actually talk about that topic. We talked about what we needed to talk about. And that's well and good too. So that was fine. I think the networking meant that that people could approach each other. We had people could put their names in the contact list, and then they would approach each other outside of the session. So someone asked me the other day, what are the outcomes of this? And I said, some of the outcomes we can't even see. We could do some ripple effect mapping, which we haven't done. That would be great to do. But I think that's the thing, it has a ripple effect in these really complex bodies of work, like community development with a disaster over the top of it. So then communities in recovery. It is an adaptive, networked process. And having that across Australia meant that people could hear what other people were doing, even the way their positions were being funded, or all of these positions are short-term funded. So one person ended up going to another government organisation and getting a 2-year grant to continue in another position because she heard about what was happening in another state. So there's all of those sorts of things that have happened out of this network. I think one of the critical things is the collegial support, that people felt like they weren't alone and they were able to connect with others in similar positions. So yeah, lots of lessons get forgotten when people are in the same situation and there's short-term contracts. There was access to timely and relevant information for our role and special guests, the networking, an opportunity to share our learnings and experiences and learn from each other who have been in this role longer. And I guess the collegial support, we kind of set that up too in terms of bringing a caring approach and the real slowing down and caring for yourself at the very beginning. Now, Michelle, I'm aware of time, so I'll just take a couple of more minutes without rushing too much. But the intangibles, you just hear in these networks and these conversations how people have been making a difference in the system. You don't always hear that. You hear a lot of bad things in the media, but it was, I guess, enlightening. And that it enabled a sharpening of insights without exposing people in their workplace. There were things people could bring here that they couldn't in their organisation, and that collegial support and comfort in hearing the human story of this work, and power and value in hearing participants' perspectives on how communities experience the interventions that were happening. So there's a program logic which I won't go through. We kind of said at the beginning that we hope this can sustain itself. At this stage, it hasn't. So we still continue to support it. And I must say, I love continuing to support it. So we'll see where it goes, but we've got a few people, like someone just contacted me the other day. How are we going? Is the first one starting up in Feb? How can I help? So I went, well, I'm gonna pull that person in at some point to co-facilitate and grow the capacity of this group to support itself. So from here, we'll start up again in February. We've expanded the audience. The audience will be government only, but anyone who works in recovery at the local level in Australia. So the steering committee I had to go to, you know, I put a couple of different options up, and one was to expand it beyond government. And the feeling was there are other things that are starting up to do exactly that, so that we need to stay in our lane and work with the government workers. So there'll be Department of Primary Industries development workers, and a whole lot of others, but we want to maintain it in terms of the running as it is. We will have an expanded audience. So the National Resilience and Recovery Agency has just started employing people at the local level. So we really feel strongly, I guess, the people who are running this, the facilitators, that the only way we're going to do that well is by working together and not competing with each other. So, and collaborating at the local level for the benefit of communities. So I would say that may be a challenge, because there are different imperatives that different organisations have. I just thought I'd put up here who else is doing stuff in this space. So as part of the Social Recovery Reference Group, we have also met with a lot of the other people who are doing community-led resilience and recovery initiatives. So there's a collaborative that started up in Victoria, and I think they're the ones that are hoping to build something for neighbourhood houses, NGOs. But don't quote me on that, but it'll be interesting to see. And yeah, you might be like to be involved in developing something like this for that group. The Paul Ramsey Foundation is doing Fire to Flourish, I think, with 5 different communities and a community development framing. The Menzies Leadership Program. FRRR has long, the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal has long been involved in this space and they've got specific disaster programs, but really anything you do to build social connection at any time will hold a community in good stead afterwards or after a disaster. Minderoo has just started a resilient communities mission and program, and the Red Cross is out there asking their workers to develop these community resilience networks. So I just want to say this is a crowded space, and one of our concerns is that communities go, you know, there's so many people who are asking to work with us that they're exhausted. So we've got to work together as philanthropy, corporates, government, between government, neighbourhood houses and other community-based organisations. And finally, on our website, we did a whole piece on community-led recovery. What does that actually mean? It's quite long, And we used Eileen Con's model around the space of co-production and shared goals. And so people felt that our reports were too long. Can we do it in one page? So we've also got a one-pager up there that tries to capture some of it, just without as much of that nuance. So we've got a website. All of those materials are on the website. In a minute, I'll put some of those in the chat, and I'll put our details in the chat, or you'll have these slides to have a look at. So that's me, Michelle. I wanted to make sure there's a little bit of time to talk.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lou. And I have been adding a lot of the links in the chat. So, you know, as you were raising them, Lou, I was making sure that we had them in the chat. And I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can just go into really open and honest question and answers and things like that. So creating a safe space so that you don't have to worry about whether your CEO is going to be watching this and you've asked a question. So I'm just going to stop the recording, and I'm also